Hello, everybody. Good morning, and welcome to Psych 49. Hope you had a nice break in between spring quarter and summer quarter. It's kind of hot here in Los Angeles, so I thought I'd get a little swim before we started class today. Looking forward to the class. It should be a lot of fun. As you'll see, the purpose of the class, besides you learning a lot of interesting things, is going to be, I guess, what I like to think about this. And I know we're all going through a very difficult time now. So I like to think about this class as providing a constructive sort of distraction from everything else that's going on. So I'm completely aware of all the stress of being home again and having to deal with quarantine and then everything that's going on in the world politically and all that. And I know that the content of the course probably isn't going to be the sort of thing that's going to be on your mind through the day. But I'm hoping during the class that we can find a kind of way of distracting ourselves by thinking about the sort of science I'll be talking about and thinking about some of the stories that we'll be discussing concerning the science. So that's the way I like to think about the course. I taught the course last quarter to a much larger group, 250 students. And that's the way we thought about it. We thought of this as a way of kind of getting into our own little world and kind of distracting ourselves for a short time from everything that's going on. And that's perfectly fine for a way of thinking about this summer course too. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the course, talk a little bit about the procedure and how we're going to kind of do the mechanics of the online teaching and all that sort of stuff. And then we'll actually give you a chance to ask some questions, and then we'll start with the actual content today. It's a long lecture, as you know. It's a 3-hour lecture. We will take a break in the middle where we can use the restroom, and then throughout we'll be taking little breaks from the lecture and doing a little discussion and go through some kind of practice questions to give you a sense of what the exam is going to be like. Okay, so let's get ready to this silliness, and you can see what I really look like. There I am. Okay, nice to meet you all. So let me talk a little bit first about how the online component of this will work. So, hold on just a sec. I've got to there we go. So right now your cameras are off, your sound is off, and that's perfectly fine. The way we had done this in the spring for this online class, which was the first time I had taught an online class, was that we decided that it was easiest for us to go through, chunks of the lecture, say 15-minute chunks, and then actually take a little break and allow students to ask questions through the chat function of Zoom. And we found that was actually the most productive way. That being said, that was a much larger class. That was 250 students. This is 20 students. So if we want to kind of do live chat, that's okay. That's absolutely fine. We'll just kind of play it by ear and see how it works. I should mention that a number of students mentioned to me that by doing this kind of chat function, people felt more comfortable. People actually felt more comfortable asking questions and responding to things than they did if they had to talk out loud. So we might want to leave it at chat. That being said, I realize that it's a much easier group to manage with 20 students, so we can actually do a live interaction too if we want. Let's see how things go. Let's try the chat thing at first, and then I'll ask you what you think is the best way of handling this. Okay? Let me just adjust a few things here. It's been a few weeks. All right. So I'm going to share my screen with you, and we will get into some of the details of the course. There we go. Hopefully you're seeing a slide right now. And I will make my image bigger. Good. So that's me. I'm Professor Lawrence Rosenblum. My office, which probably won't mean anything to you right now, is in the psychology building. I don't think we'll be back in there, obviously, this summer. But the way office hours work is by appointment, and we'll be doing it by Zoom, obviously. That's my email address. I know some of you already emailed me asking questions about the course. And you're welcome to do that at any time. Setting up a Zoom meeting is probably the easiest thing. You've already been to discussion sections, so you've already met your wonderful TA, Serena, who will also be helping you through the course. She's already taught the course and knows a lot about the material, so that's going to be a real benefit for you folks. The only thing I can say is there is still room in about adding you to the course. There is still room in the course, but I can't add you and Serena can't add you. I believe you need to be added through whatever that thing is called. I can't remember the mechanism, and if you have trouble doing that for whatever reason, you can come back to me and then I'll see if I can help you with any sort of contacting the student advisors or anything like that. So there is still room in the course though, so if you're just sitting in and you're thinking it might be fun to take it, there is, I think, a few slots left. Okay, let me talk about what the exams are like. Because it's such a short quarter, and because people are, clearly under duress still, given everything that's going on with quarantine, I've actually decided to change the requirements of the course from how it usually is set up. So you will only have 2 exams during the course, a midterm and a final, and you will be given a lot of flexibility as to when you'll be able to take those exams. The exam will be taken online, and you can take it, I'll give you a 2-day period or so where you can take the exam at your leisure. It will be timed. I think it's timed right now for 80 minutes or something like that. And it's 60 multiple choice questions on each exam, and they count, they're weighted the same. And they are not cumulative. In other words, the exam that you'll be taking at the end of the course will just be based on the last half of the material that you'll be learning in the course, everything that you'll be learning after the exam. And then what I do is I add up the points and then I assign a grade. I'll give you a sense of how you're doing after the midterm by giving you kind of a grade range of how your score fit into the ABC range. That should give you some feedback on how you did, but I don't assign any letter grades until after both exams are taken. I see how people did on the exam, and then we assign a grade at that point. I should mention, I've set up the course to be, again, mostly a distraction for you, a fun way of kind of keeping your mind busy. I want you to learn the material. There's some important material for you to learn, but I understand a lot of you are taking this as an elective, which is great. More power to you. I think it's wonderful. I'm going to treat it like that type of course. It's not going to be a terribly demanding course. There's just 2 exams. And I'm going to make the exams very, very fair, in the sense, well, there'll be a lot of things that are going on to add to that. First, as I said, you'll be given a lot of flexibility as to when you can take those exams. We have a 2-day period where you can take it during any 80-minute session. Secondly, we will be doing questions during the lectures, practice questions, which will actually be derived literally from the exams you'll be taking. The exams will be based on discussion section material, lecture material, and stuff in the book that's not covered in either discussion or lecture. But during the actual lectures, I'll be taking breaks every 15, 20 minutes and be giving you practice questions, which you'll see are more than practice questions. They are actually questions derived right from the exam. So the questions I'll be giving during lecture for you to practice will literally be questions you'll then see again on the exams. You'll have to understand what the answers are, and you'll have to remember them, but that should help you significantly. So about 1/3 of the questions you will have on the exam are taken literally from questions I'm already giving you in the lecture. That makes it much easier. Now, there's something I need to say about how that works technically, because we didn't realize this at first. As you know, I'll be posting the lectures after I give the lecture. The video of the lecture will be posted later on that same day, probably. It takes a little while to upload it to YouTube, but you'll have multiple chances to watch the lecture. However, we realized last quarter that when I give you these practice questions, it's through the polling mechanism on Zoom. They are, for some reason, not recorded in the video. I have no idea why Zoom set this up like this, but you will be able to see the exam questions as if you're sitting here live during my actual lectures. They'll come up on your screen and you'll see the choices and be able to select them and all that sort of thing. But they are not questions that you'll then be able to see later on during if you look at the recordings of these lectures. So that's why that says screen capture the practice poll questions. So, I'll remind you of this when we do our first one today, but when I post those questions, I'm telling you to take a picture of that screen so you'll actually have a visual form of the questions I'll be asking you that I'll then be repeating on the actual exams. So for some reason, the video recordings of Zoom lectures don't record an image of the questions. I'll be saying out loud what the question is, so you'll be reminded and you can write it down at that point. But I want to remind you of that as we go through. We didn't realize that until about a third of the way through the quarter last time. This time we'll know ahead of the time. And as I said, the exams will cover the lecture, the book, and the discussion sections. So you will need to attend the discussion sections because Serena will be helping me create some questions for the exam that are based on material she's going to be discussing and I won't be discussing. Okay, the book might cover that to some degree, but it's important that you go to the discussion sections for getting this unique material. Okay. The first exam will happen about halfway through the class, which I guess is week 3. It's a 5-week class this summer. And the last one, the quote final exam, which is just on the last half of the course, will be taken during the 2-day final period, and I'll allow you to take it whenever you want during that 2-day period, which I believe is the 24th and 25th. I think that's the Thursday and Friday, or Friday and Saturday. I don't know. We'll certainly remember and figure that out before the test comes up. But there is a 2-day exam period where you'll be able to take the exam whenever you want. Okay, and finally the book. I put up a PDF version of the book for you online. It's in the materials section on your iLearn page, and I realize it's hard to get the book this time of, given that we're in quarantine, you can't go to the bookstore. It can take Amazon a little while to get the books in. So I put the PDF version on. You're welcome to use that. Just don't tell my publisher I'm not really supposed to do that, but I think they'd understand. But if you want a hard copy of the book, you can go ahead and order it. There's also a version of the book that's audio recording. If you can't get enough of my voice, you can hear my voice on the audio recording. The book comes in different forms, and I actually have a copy of the book here. Here it is. This is what it looks like. Oh, hold on just a second. Yeah. Yeah, here's the book here. For just your interest. Oh my gosh. Holy cow. I guess people have been buying the book again. It's gotten hot again. All right. Anyway, let's take a little break here from lecture, and I'll see if you have any questions. So I'll stop sharing, and I will open chat up. Okay. B. Smurber asks a question. Thank you for Rick. Shoot. Okay, I already gave it away. There's a Rick roll on the internet site. You have to find it. Glad your generation knows what Rick rolling is. I think it's a wonderful sort of internet gimmick. Can I intern for you, please? Yeah, we are going to be looking for research assistants. So if you're serious about that, please do email me. I don't know how many we're looking for in the summer. I mean, research, I'm sure you're aware, has been, kind of really changed. Everything has to be done online now. We usually run subjects in our laboratory, that can't be done anymore. At least now until the quarantine ends. So we are going to be using research assistants. I don't know how many. I don't know if we need them this summer, but if you are interested, please contact me. I'd be happy to help you with that. Okay, other questions about, can everyone hear me? I want to make sure. I want everyone's hearing me. Yeah, say yes, you can hear me. Say hello. Say hello, just say hello. Yes, yes.
Hi, Professor, how are you?
Good, good, thank you. Oh, you're saying yes vocally. That's fine too, but if you just want to write, just want to make sure the microphone's working and everything. Yes, okay. Yes, good, thank you, Alex. Okay, great. William, thank you. Good. So it sounds like everything's working okay. Are there questions about the test, about the nature of the exam? Any questions about the book? About how it's hot again? Anything like that? All right. It's December. It's going to be casual. It's going to be fun. We're going to have a nice time. We're going to have a nice relaxed time. We'll do fun things during the class. Maybe I'll burn other things like the computer. We'll see. All right. We'll see if you guys prefer doing the chat, or if you want to talk a lot live, we can do that too. Let's just see how it goes for the first part of the lecture today and see how you feel about doing chat as the lecture goes on. We could do a hybrid version too, where some of you chat, some of you talk. I have no problem with that. It looks like right now that we have about 15 participants in the live lecture. That's great. That means there'll be another 5 that will be watching the lecture later on. I'll make sure they understand the situation with the polling questions. If there's no other questions, then I guess we can get started on the lecture. Okay, anything else? Any last minute questions about the nature of the exam or anything like that? Okay, you'll probably have questions as things go on. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that. Let's share our screen and start talking about the content of the course. Now, I'm sure you're very aware that you can make the screens on your computer, the screen of me and the screen of the slides at relative sizes. So go ahead and adjust that any way you want to. It's no problem, whatever works best for you. But let's start talking about what the course is about. So the idea in the course is this. You might have taken a perception course somewhere else. I'm sorry, was there a question? I just heard a voice.
Yeah, I have a quick question. Do you post your lecture slides after or before?
They are posted now, actually.
Oh, okay.
I believe they are posted now. You can go check on iLearn. I think they're all posted now. There might be some changes. Okay, there might be changes to the content a little bit. There's always new material coming out, and some of the things I think are so cool I want to tell you about them. So there might be changes. Those are slides from last quarter. But I will certainly let you know when we make changes to the lecture slides. And it should be obvious as we go through these. Okay, are there questions? Good. All right. So you might have taken a perception course, you know, in high school or maybe as part of an introductory psychology class. But what I'm interested in teaching you is a kind of a part of perception that often isn't covered in the courses. And it's one of the aspects of perception that actually got me into studying perception in general, is that there are perceptual skills that we all have, or at least have access to, that we are unaware of having, okay? And a lot of how we can learn about those secret or hidden perceptual skills is through looking at individuals who've learned to refine their perceptual skills for various reasons. Maybe reasons that they've lost a sense, that they're blind or deaf, and they've had to enhance their other senses to kind of compensate for that loss. And probably much more common is the case that, you know, when we learn to, you know, a new skill like becoming a musician or, you know, practicing something as an athlete, we are in those cases refining our perceptual skill as well. And we find that the kind of procedure, the process that allows us as, you know, sensory intact individuals to refine those skills are kind of smaller versions of what the deaf, blind, are doing to refine their skills. So the big deal here is, the big issue is that we are, in fact, perceiving much more than we realize as we go through the world. You know, I start off the book by asking the reader to try to introspect on what their perceptual experience is at the moment. And you know, you can kind of introspect and think about what you're looking at the time and what you're hearing at the time. You know, what you're touching, if you kind of think about it for a second. And then you can maybe lick your lips and say, oh yeah, I can maybe taste a little of the sweetness I had from this morning's cereal. You can smell, you know, kind of sniff and say, yeah, I recognize a couple of smells of the room you're in right now. Of course, I smell nothing but fish, right? But your kind of, I guess, current perceptual experience is just a very small part of what your brain is actually doing with perception. We have these skills, we have these processes that are occurring all the time, but we aren't getting conscious access to. Okay. What we say is that sometimes that we have implicit perceptual abilities. We have perceptual abilities that we aren't aware of. That's just what's meant by implicit here. And I also have that scary word subliminal there. And let me say something about that word. It's going to be something that we use throughout the quarter, subliminal. Subliminal perception, you may have heard in various contexts, like with advertising or hypnosis or something like that. And I'm not going to be talking about it in that context. I don't believe there is serious kind of coercion of what happens to us unconsciously with perception. But there's a lot of perception that occurs under our awareness. And that's all that subliminal means. Lyman is the word for, you know, kind of our awareness threshold. And so sub-Lyman or subliminal just means that there's something going on underneath our awareness, our threshold of awareness. And it doesn't mean that it's making us do things we don't want to do, or at least not very much. Okay? It doesn't mean that you can be coerced into buying a product you don't want to buy, or coerced into, you know, having a romantic connection you don't want to have. Okay? It's not like that. But there are processes, in fact, some fascinating processes that occur under the level of our awareness, below our consciousness. And much of what we'll be talking about is occurring for most of us like that. One of the cool things we'll also be learning about is through various means of introspection and demonstrations and then practice, we can make these unconscious skills conscious for us sometimes and improve those skills. Okay? We'll learn about how we can do that as we go through our various examples and demonstrations. But something else about these implicit perceptual skills is really cool. And that is, we share a lot of these skills with animals. So a lot of what we'll be talking about in the very beginning of our first topic, something you learned about yesterday in discussion section, we share some of these skills with animals. So you learned about bats yesterday, right? At least it was mentioned that bats use this method to echolocate the world. And that's something that we do as well. You know, you probably, if you have a doggy or a kitty, you know that these animals can use their scent system in really impressive ways. Well, as it turns out, we have access to some of those skills as well. Not quite as refined as dogs and cats, but things like scent tracking and recognizing other animals or people, in our case, other people by their scent, is something that our unconscious brains are doing all the time. So we do share skills with animals. So we'll be looking at animals a lot to see how they do their sorts of cool perceptual skills to give us an idea of how our brains might be doing the same thing. And as I said, many of these skills that we'll be talking about can be enhanced through practice, through not even necessarily being conscious of what we're perceiving as we practice. So, you know, as you're becoming a better tennis player, your visual system is getting refined in really cool ways. And you might not even be aware of how you can now see things more clearly and enhance your, sense of how quickly something is coming towards you. You know, you know that you're a better tennis player. but your perceptual skills are being enhanced along with your just general improvement in perception. Okay, and we'll talk about other examples where you can become conscious of that sort of thing. So, one of my favorite topics in the book is based on the interview I did with a wine expert, somebody who's learned to be able to distinguish wines based on various dimensions of the grape that's used and the type of vineyard the grape was grown in. And in those cases, those experts, those wine experts, actually have to read about wine and read about wine production techniques and about what type of soil has what type of flavor effects on different grapes. And that's kind of like book learning almost. That's kind of like, studying like you would study for an exam in order to enhance your perceptual skill. So it's a different type of thing. In that case, it's almost a conscious improvement of a perceptual skill. That happens as well. And that's where we're going to learn many of the things we're going to be discussing. And in fact, most of what we'll be discussing in terms of our perceptual skill and our perceptual, our unconscious perceptual abilities will be motivated by discussions with experts. So this, I'll let you know right away, was my favorite part of writing the book. Interviewing people who have learned to refine their perceptual skills. And I talked to individuals who were sensory impaired in various ways. I talked to people whose profession or whose hobby kind of required them to improve their perceptual skills. And the insight that these folks provided was just fascinating. I think there's 30 interviews in the book or so, but I interviewed probably twice as many people, to learn about these things that half of them didn't get discussed in the book. But I enjoyed it so much. These are people who often don't talk about the refinement of their perceptual skills, but when they do, they are so engaging and just insightful about how the senses work, even if they've never studied perceptual psychology, which was really exciting. And then we're going to find out that all these things we're learning about perceptual skills that are being enhanced actually help to exemplify, actually help to demonstrate, illustrate some of the kind of more important concepts in modern science, modern neuroscience. So yeah, it's going to be fun. We're going to learn about people who've learned to improve their perceptual skills in various ways, by various vignettes and descriptions of their lives, and then how they've learned to improve these different perceptual skills. But we're also going to have our eye on the big picture. And what I mean by that is we're going to see if these kind of examples that we're learning can help us understand big issues that are emerging in the science of perceptual neuropsychology. Okay, we're gonna, it's an elective course. I realize many of you are, taking this as maybe your one science course in college. We're not gonna, assume that you know a lot about neuroscience or biology or anything like that. We're gonna start from the beginning, but we're gonna allow all this exciting stuff we're learning about this quarter to teach us stuff about some general strategies of the brain. Those strategies are going to include neuroplasticity, which is the general idea that the brain is flexible and plastic and changes with experience. And the way it does so depends on certain things that cells do with each other, and the way the brain kind of gets reshaped. And that's one of the most, kind of, if you've taken any, brain course in your life, that's one of the most exciting kind of, I wouldn't say discovery, but kind of concepts that's emerged over the last 20 years of brain science. When I was an undergraduate, we thought, when you're a little kid, you're lucky because your brain's flexible. By the time, I don't know, you're a teenager, that's it. Your brain's really static. And yes, of course, you can learn new things after that, right? You go to college, hopefully you're learning new things right now, right? But the brain doesn't change that much. And that's a wrong idea. Now we know the brain changes a lot. It changes a lot in how things are connected. And we know a lot now about how those connections, those new connections emerge. And we're going to let some of what we're discussing this quarter teach us about that. We're also going to learn about a concept that's become really, I guess, important in the last 15 years, called the mirror system. And I'm not going to get into too much detail about this now, but what I'm going to say about it is that we now understand that when it comes to people interacting with each other, when it comes to people, even interacting with your family, which is how we're constrained right now, but interacting with people we're first meeting, we are constantly doing kind of a low-level imitation of them. That imitation occurs in our body language, and sometimes you're aware of that. Like, meet somebody at a party that you find interesting, maybe you want to get to know better. You might find yourself kind of imitating their body language a little bit, right? Sometimes when we're talking to somebody with a foreign accent, we might find ourselves kind of taking on a little bit of that foreign accent, right? I think we've all had that type of experience before. And those are times we're conscious of these things. But most of the time we're doing these subtle imitations. We're doing it at an unconscious level, okay? And again, these are very subtle. It's not like, what I like to, the example I like to give as a contrast is that, you remember when you were little and either, if you're an older sibling, your younger sibling would imitate you, or if you're a younger sibling, you do the imitation of your older sibling. My boys did it, right? They would imitate each other to really bug each other in the car driving, just to get it, to annoy each other, to get it on each other's nerves. They'd imitate each other. And it's really annoying. That's not what I'm talking about. That's the contrast, right? What I'm talking about is very subtle sort of imitation that we do in terms of our vocal inflections, in terms of even the subtle things like how we kind of connect our vowels and consonants as we're speaking. We do subtle imitation of how somebody else is doing that as we're talking to them. Okay, maybe that's not too surprising to you, but what would be more surprising is this: that it seems to serve a purpose, that low-level imitation. It seems to help with the social interaction. It seems to have an effect over how successful the interaction is, how much the other person is liked, okay, how pleasant the interaction seems. And even more fundamentally than that, it seems to have an effect on how we perceive. So if there is something happening so that kind of subtle unconscious imitation is prevented, we sometimes have trouble perceiving the way we normally would. Here's a great example. I always do this. I try to save the examples for later on, but I'm just too excited. People who have Botox, I don't know, maybe you know somebody who has Botox, maybe you have Botox yourself. You know how Botox works. It's injections into the facial muscles, so it kind of prevents wrinkling from happening. I live in LA. I have, friends that have had Botox injections. It's worked wonderfully. They love it. They look great. Good for them. But getting injections of Botox does exactly what I mentioned. It prevents the muscles of the face from moving as they normally would. Okay. So people with Botox, and you may have seen people who have too much Botox, their own facial expressions don't look quite the same. They don't smile as much as they used to, maybe. These are people who've had massive injections, people that have had too much, right? But even if you haven't had too much, even if you look pretty much the same, it does affect your own expressions. But here's the cool thing. It affects how you perceive somebody else's expression. So, imagine Rosenblum is starting to look old. He is. And he's gotten injections. There we go. And I can't smile as much as I used to. Here, do I look like I've had Botox a little now? I can't smile as much as I used to. Makes sense. But the interesting thing is it not only affects my expressions, it affects how I perceive other people's expressions. And what that suggests is by restricting my own imitation of other people's expressions, okay, I can't perceive them quite as well. So the mirror systems we'll be talking about are systems in the brain that constantly are imitating other people in very subtle ways, but in ways that not only, kind of facilitate social interaction, but also have direct effects on how we perceive basic things like facial expressions. That's cool. Isn't that cool? Okay. Finally, the last concept that we'll be learning about that will help us kind of understand these new discoveries in perceptual neuroscience is the idea of what we call multisensory primacy. And this is actually where my research lies. I do research on multisensory perception, how most of my research is on how our hearing system and our visual system gets integrated for us to recognize things like faces and talkers and speech, all this sort of stuff. And so I'll be talking a lot about this as the quarter goes on. We used to think that the brain was kind of subdivided into a region that could see, a region that could hear, a region that could touch, and on and on. But we now know it's much more complicated than that. The regions of the brain that we thought were just set aside for touching are actually reactive, are actually activated when we hear things and when we touch things. And the way that occurs is fascinating. You'll learn about this as we start meeting some of the blind individuals we'll be discussing in the beginning, because they don't have information, visual information coming to the visual parts of their brain. Okay, their brains are reserved now for hearing and touching. But that's not just true of blind people. There are things that our visual brains can do besides seeing. And the notion that our brains are divided up based on the sensory systems is probably wrong. Even, I certainly learned that when I was in college. You might have learned that in high school. Okay. It turns out that our brains are probably kind of designed to pick up stuff that's in the world, events that are occurring in the world through multiple senses at the same time. In other words, the brain doesn't care whether we're seeing a face or hearing somebody speak in some ways. The same parts of the brain are going to be lighting up. The brain wants to know who's out there. Is that somebody that I know? Is it somebody I don't know? Is it somebody who has an angry intent towards me? I can hear it in their voice. I can see it in their face. Or is it somebody who has a loving intent towards me? Okay. And the brain cares about those things. It doesn't care whether it's seeing that information or hearing that information in the voice. And that's kind of a revamped idea of how the brain is divided up based on the senses. In some way, the brain doesn't care that much about which sense it's using at any one time. It just wants information about the world and what the world means to me. Okay, and that's what this multisensory primacy idea means. Okay, so what we're going to do now is I'm going to continue with this discussion of the introduction to the course. Let's see, what are we doing here? We're doing okay. Actually, let's take our little break here and do a question, just so we can give ourselves a breather and see how everyone is doing. What I'm going to do is put up a polling question. Okay, so I believe you can't see this yet, if I remember correctly, but I want to make sure the polling works right. I just want to know how many people are freshmen, or going to be freshmen, rising sophomores, rising junior, rising senior, just to get a sense of how much experience you've had here at UCR, and how many, get an idea of how many courses people have had in general. So the question is this: it's not a test question, obviously. What's your year in school? And the question is, I am a rising, A, freshman, B, sophomore, C, junior, D, senior. And so now I'm going to launch the poll and go ahead and respond, if you wouldn't mind, and we'll get this information. Oh, there's a lot of seniors, a lot of rising seniors. Okay. Great. We got that about right. Okay. So I got about 15 participants. If you could, I just want to make sure that everyone can respond to this. Maybe not everyone's present, but it looks like we have about 11 people. So if you haven't responded and you can, go ahead and please do. Okay. All right. Great. I just want to make sure everyone's able to do this. I'll give you another 10 seconds. Okay. So now what I'm going to do is end the poll. And now I'm going to share the results with everybody. Now, this right now, if this were a real test question, and you will get one later on in our lecture, if this were a real test question, this would be a good time to take a snapshot of your screen. Because what this is going to do is provide you a visual copy of the question along with the correct answer, or at least it should be the correct answer. The correct answer is senior. Now, in this case, it looks like we have more seniors than anything else, but there's a lot of sophomores and some juniors as well. Good. All right. That's good to know. Thank you very much. That's useful. That means you've got experience. You're not new to the UCR. Okay. And so now what I'll do is I'll stop sharing, and hopefully, if this were a regular test question, you would have taken a picture of it. Because again, it's not going to show up on the video. Good. And, yeah, let me now make sure that worked for everybody. Let me know if you have any questions so far about the course. I put the chat back up so I can see the chat. Or you had any problems with the polling. I just want to make sure that's all working okay. You all happy? No questions? Okay. By the way, and this was another reason to use the chat function. You can type in questions as I lecture. Like something comes to your mind and you type in question, you find something really interesting. You say, I want to ask them this question, but I don't want to wait for them to take the break. Just type in the question, and it's very easy for me to go back and look at the question. I'll see every question that's been asked during the class, and I'll be able to answer questions that were, say, asked 10 minutes previous to when I stopped for the break. Okay. All right. Any questions? Everyone seems happy? Good. Okay. Then let's continue with our lecture. Okay. All right. So I'm going to just go through kind of each chapter and each lecture in the book just to kind of give a general introduction to the course. We're going to be talking about a lot of these in detail, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but I think it's a nice idea to give a general introduction to a course like this so you know what we'll be going. So the first thing you'll be learning, which you actually started learning yesterday, is that you hear silent objects. And that seems like such an odd title. And I'll be honest with you, I was kind of encouraged to give provocative titles to chapters and chapter sections. And so that's one of the examples of that. You hear silent objects. You can hear things that don't make sound. And that sounds very odd. Well, how can your brain possibly hear silent objects? And from yesterday's discussion section that it does so by hearing how sound is reflected from objects that don't make sound. Okay, and you learned about probably Daniel Kish or somebody like Daniel Kish. I don't know if Serena showed a video to you of Daniel Kish, but you'll learn about him in detail probably later today. He's a friend of mine. He was a UCR undergraduate like you guys, then went out and got his master's at San Bernardino and got I guess, certification in blind rehabilitation. Daniel, as you might know, has been blind from birth. He had no light vision or very little light vision, and then had his eyes removed by the time he was 2 years old because he had retinoblastomas, which are cancer of the retina. So he has no light vision. However, Daniel, amazing guy, didn't let that stop him. Even as a child, he learned to ride a bike. And now he leads mountain biking expeditions and hiking and teaches people how to get around the same way he's able to get around. Hopefully you'll see something like a moving video. I understand we have a sense now that Zoom isn't going to show videos very well, but I'm hoping that you can see Daniel riding a bike around his neighborhood, or at least, a choppy version of that. And he is absolutely doing what you're seeing right now. I'll talk about how he's able to do that in just a second, how he's able to determine where he is. Well, that's what this first topic we'll be talking about. But the way Daniel's getting around in general, the way he's able to hike and get around in his daily excursions is through echolocation, which you learned about, right? He clicks, he makes a sound, and that sound reflects off of objects and comes back to him. His brain then is able to use that reflected sound to determine where he is. It's like a bat, and we'll talk more about the details of how bats do this in an hour or so. But bats send out a signal. That signal hits the walls of a cave, or you know, we have bats in our backyard, and they fly around at night. They're making little chirpy sounds, and those chirps are hitting limbs of trees or telephone wires, and they're able to avoid colliding with those things based on how the sound is reflected to him. To the bats. And that's exactly what Daniel is doing. And it's exactly what you can do if you tried this yesterday. Now, I know Serena said that some of you bravely got up and tried this in your home. I'm so proud. It's great. You know, when we teach this class live, we actually take people out in front of the psychology building and do basically what you're seeing there. We have people walk to a big board that's being held up, and they are typically saying, hello, hello, testing 1, 2, 1, 2. Sometimes they are clicking if they feel brave enough to do so. And what we find is with 10 minutes of practice, they are able to walk to the board and stop before they get there without bumping into it. And of course, we move the board to make sure it's not just an issue of counting steps or anything like that. But it is something that everybody we've ever tested in these sorts of experiments have been able to do with just 10 minutes of practice. Really, it's just an issue of not being nervous, not feeling self-conscious trying to do this. We tell them all about echolocation and all that, and they figure it out. And they can do this within 10 minutes of practice. So what we're going to be learning is that, in fact, you do use sound like bats. You can use sound reflections of sounds that you're making if you're saying hello or clicking or making another type of sound. But we're also going to see that this is an ability that you have even if you're not making this sound. And the idea that you are using reflected sound all the time is something that you're going to learn through discussions with sound engineers. This is one of my favorite sets of interviews. I talk to people who do sound recording for movies and TV and theater. And they'll say that, yes, they are very aware that the human brain, the audience's brain, can use reflected sound, even if they're not the ones that are making the initial sound for echolocation. They are using reflected sound to get a sense of how large a room is. Okay? They'll also tell you that they have to be very careful as they record things for a scene in a TV show to make sure that where the microphones are placed makes sense given where the listener is going to be as they're watching a scene. So your brain is sensitive to where you are located in space based on the reflections your brain is getting. So you hear your position in space. And then finally, we're going to talk about instances where objects like boards and things that you might encounter on a street, I don't know what, mailboxes, big mailboxes, maybe lampposts, even those other things aren't making sound. They are shaping the sounds that are made around them. They obstruct sound, in other words, and your brain is sensitive to those obstructed sounds as well. And so these are all examples, then, where your brain is able to detect how things that are reflecting sound, shaping sound, obstructing sound, but aren't making sound, okay, can tell you where you are and what's out there in front of you. Your brain is able to use the sound that is shaped by silent objects to help you navigate. The most, kind of striking example of this is certainly Daniel Kish, but I'm going to hopefully convince you that this is something that your brain has been doing forever. You certainly can't, I wouldn't recommend you go bike riding with a blindfold right now, but you can certainly get a sense of the room you are in based on how sounds are sculpted by silent objects. Okay? And then what we're going to do is move into another topic of sound, and it's not going to be sound reflections made by silent objects. We're going to start talking about all the different ways we can perceive sound from things that make sound, but in really, really sophisticated ways. Here is a blind baseball player. And how do they bat? Well, they use a beeping ball. And he's blindfolded, by the way. He's a blind baseball player, but everyone is blindfolded in this sport, as you'll learn, because they want to equalize the, the information that comes to these folks. These are baseball players who are basing their performance totally on sound. And so since some legally blind people do have a little light vision, everyone is blindfolded to equalize that. Okay. But they use a beeping ball along with beeping bases. Now, if you're lucky, I brought, hold on just a second. Oh, stay there, everybody. Don't leave. Because I bought a beeping ball. Kind of annoying if it's not out in the field. It's really loud, but it's a beeping softball. If we were live, I'd ask you to catch this. Okay. But this just kind of gives you a sense of what the ball's like. It's the exact type of ball you're seeing him hit there. Okay, we'll talk about this in detail and when we get to that chapter. But this will give you a sense of what the sport is like a little bit. I'll show you this again and turn up the sound, but you can see they're actually running to one of two large bases that they have to hit before the ball is controlled by the blind outfielders. But the fact that they can actually perform this, whether it's batting the ball that's coming towards them, running at the base before they get there, they have to pull out their arms, or diving in the right place to stop the ball when they're in their field, they're anticipating. And that's something your brain is really good at doing. It's good at anticipating a sound source as it's coming towards us. Okay, and so what I like to say that the brain has a whole part of its structure dedicated to anticipating a sound that's coming towards us, or anticipating our movements as we're coming towards a sound. Both of those are nice examples to that. And so what I like to say, and I mean what the provocative title in the book is that you hear the future. In order to bat a beeping ball, you have to know something about where the ball is going to be in half a second. Okay? And you can use the information of the sound getting louder and, as it turns out, a little bit clearer as it's coming towards you to be able to anticipate and hear the future position of the ball. That's the idea. So we'll be talking about that in all the details of beep softball, and then there's also beep tennis, which we'll learn a little bit about in probably next class. But we're also going to learn about other things having to do with sound. We're going to learn about hearing the shape of things. So in other words, you're able to determine if something is hit, say, by a hammer, a metal plate is hit by a hammer, you're able to determine the shape of that thing that's been hit. And we're going to learn about how your brain is able to do that. And then we're going to talk about one of my favorite topics, and that's music. I've been a musician as a hobby since I was, 10, 9. I know some of you also have experience in music, whether you're a DJ or, you like making your own stuff, maybe, hip hop on GarageBand. My kids enjoy that sometimes. And we're going to talk about the fact that we used to think that musicians, people that had, kind of formal musical training, heard music very differently than people who did not have musical training. But we're going to learn that as long as you listen to music, you've listened to music for some period of time, your brain has been shaped by music, and you're able to hear a lot more nuances about the music than we ever realized. And we know this now from using kind of different methods. We're asking, musical novices or people who aren't trained, but are, longtime music listeners, different types of questions about how they're perceiving the music. And then also doing brain scanning. We can learn that, the differences between trained musicians and music appreciators in the brain isn't as different as we used to think. So you do have, as a music listener, a degree of musical expertise that you probably didn't know about, which will be fun for you to learn. Importantly, and this is one of the things I've been thinking about a lot over the last few years, just personally, is we know what music means. We're going to learn about how music not just conveys happy and sad emotion, but it can kind of act as a metaphor. And if you think to some of your favorite songs, whether, it's a rap song or a song with a melody or both or whatever, you'll realize that there's a really interesting way in which the music matches the lyrics. And the reason it does so is because the music is somehow creating kind of metaphor for the meaning that the lyrics are conveying. The most obvious example is, when somebody sings a sad ballad and the music is kind of slow and sad. So Adele, you're thinking of, one of her sad songs. Does she have a song called Hello, or she starts a song called Hello? It has a certain kind of slow, sad, sullen sort of music behind it. Those are the obvious examples, but it gets much more sophisticated than that. Your brain can pick up things like irony in music and sarcasm and jealousy and anger and all that sort of stuff in the music. And the way that music then matches the lyrics is a really cool thing that your brain is doing as a music listener. Okay, we'll learn a lot about that. And then we'll move on from sound and start talking about smell. And I gotta let you know, I love smell. Before I started doing research for the book, I taught perception classes, but I didn't really ever learn that much about smell. If you ever take another perception class, if you've taken one or will be taking one, you'll learn that most of the time you're talking about vision, and then you do talk about hearing. And then maybe you get a lecture on smell, maybe a tiny bit more. Sometimes smell and taste are put together, and that's sadly how I used to do it, spending very little time. Because at the time, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, there wasn't as much research. There wasn't enough kind of deep research on smell. But boy, within the last 15 years or so, the smell research has gotten so cool. And as I was doing research for the book and talking with people in the field, and talking to folks I interviewed because they had a kind of a unique skill for smell, I started to realize that, boy, this is a very cool scent. One of the reasons I think that smell is one of the coolest scents is that most of it, I think, happens unconsciously. So, you walk into a room, you walk into a kitchen, or something like that, and you smell baking bread, you smell, dinner cooking, maybe you smell, the remnants from last night's dinner or something like that. But then that fades away, right? Maybe you walk into a gym and you smell, sweat, that sort of thing, but that fades away. You don't really notice that anymore. You become what's sometimes called nose blind, and that happens relatively fast. That's what happens consciously. But what happens unconsciously is that your brain is smelling all the time, and it's smelling for very sophisticated reasons. I think that's one of the coolest things about smell is that a majority of what goes on with smell is happening unconsciously. It's not really like vision or hearing. There's a lot going on unconsciously with vision and hearing, but we are so consciously aware of what we're seeing and what we're hearing. With smell, we're not very conscious of that at all because, I'm not detecting anything in now, really. But unconsciously, I'm picking up the smells from this room, from the fish. Yeah, from the fish. Now, yeah, I can smell the fish. Okay, I'm kidding. The room I'm in, which you're not going to learn the truth of this room ever, is no longer something I can detect, the smells of this room. Okay, you get the idea. But we're going to learn some details about the smell literature that I think you're going to find fascinating. What we used to do for our discussion sections is actually have people go outside and do some scent tracking as if they're doggies. And there you see somebody doing it right now. What we used to do is put a rope that was soaked in peppermint down in the grass and then put it like in some sort of like kind of maze-like shape, some sort of path that was kind of zigzaggy, and have people get down on their hands and knees and just use the smell to guide their crawling so they could follow the path of the scent. And it was something that people could do well. I mean, at first they feel kind of self-conscious. I tried it. I thought I have to try this sort of thing. So I got on my hands and knees. We put blindfolds on. We put, I don't know if you can see this, but just to make sure that the only thing we have access to is smell, is we put headphones on people so they can't hear where they are. We even put knee pads on and gloves so they can't feel the rope. That's how obsessive compulsive we are as scientists. So the only thing they're using is smell. And at first it feels weird, it feels embarrassing because people are watching you as they're going through campus. But what you find is that, undergrads that are in the course like this can do this. They can follow it based on scent. And I'll tell you what the experience is like when we go through the chapter. It's really, it's kind of more, I guess, compelling than you would ever think it would be. It's a really interesting sort of example. So, yes, you can scent track. And you're going to learn in section, I think I have the section, teachers go through this case, Serena will go through this, that the way you're able to do this is through the fact that your nostrils are getting two different scents at the same time, or getting two different inputs at the same time. And you might know this about the ears and the eyes, that the fact that we have two ears on the side of our heads can allow our brains to tell where a sound is coming from, right? Reaches this ear before that ear. The fact that we have two eyes allow us to or help us see in 3 dimensions, right? You know that through your 3D movies. Well, the fact that you have two inputs in your nose helps us determine where a scent is located. And so what you're seeing there is the front of a person's nose. It's a kind of a heat image of the front of a person's nose. And you can see that the air is coming into the nostrils differently for each nostril, which is really interesting. So, and then, we'll talk about the t-shirt in a second. But yes, you can scent track, and that we use our nostrils, the fact that we have 2 nostrils, to locate where a smell is. That would allow us to do scent tracking if it were something that was important, but it easily allows us to do a determination of where the smell is coming from. That's no problem. But then we're going to talk about some of the really cool things of smell that we are probably doing all the time. So, based on research that involves asking somebody to wear t-shirts, say, that's why you're seeing a t-shirt there, for 24 hours, and then taking that t-shirt and then kind of putting it in a pile of 10 t-shirts, you would be able to pick out which t-shirt was worn by somebody you knew, okay? So you are able to recognize people from their natural smell. The t-shirt example here is one where we ask people to wear t-shirts for 24 hours without having them shower, put on deodorant, because that's a good way of capturing somebody's natural smell. Okay, we'll talk about it. Sounds icky, I know, but we'll talk about what's really going on there. It's not as icky as it sounds. So you know the secret smell of people. But based on those sort of t-shirt experiments, we're going to show something even more surprising. That you know the secret smell of fertility, of genetic compatibility with another person, and what we call symmetry. And I won't get into the details now. But, the symmetry in animals, including humans, symmetry, do they look the same on the left and the right? Or is their structure the same on the left and the right? Is that something that, it turns out that's something that conveys genetic health. And that kind of feature, that genetic health that is correlated with visible symmetry, is also correlated with a person's smell. It's deep stuff. I mean, this is really deep stuff. And the other deep thing about smell, as you're going to learn, is how it shapes our memories. And you know, you probably have experience with this, right? You're say walking, you know, outside now, and there's somebody in front of you, hopefully 6 feet away, but they're wearing a certain perfume, or they've used a certain shampoo or a certain deodorant or something like that. And you get a whiff of it, and it brings back a memory, maybe a memory of a past relationship or a friendship, or a memory of a grandparent who used to wear that type of perfume or something like that. And as it comes back, that memory, it seems to have an emotional component to it that other types of sense-induced memories don't have, right? So the idea here is that when we have a memory that's induced by a smell, baking bread maybe, perfumes, right? That memory comes back, and as it does, it seems to have more of an emotional component than memories that are just created from looking at things or from listening to things or something like that. We'll talk about how that works. I think you're going to be really surprised how that works. It's a very surprising sort of process by which that works, and I think Serena will do some demonstrations for you to understand that. Okay, and then we'll continue talking about memory, and get into some of the stuff I find most interesting. I'm sorry, not memory. We'll continue talking about scent, and get into some of the most interesting things that I find about scent that has to do not with what we can be kind of led to experience consciously. So those are, even though I said scent is mostly unconscious, all those examples, as you'll see, are instances where you're asked to consciously smell something. We're going to talk about a whole field of research that tests what's happening when we're unaware of a scent being present. Okay, so we'll be talking about the fact that if a very low level odor of a cleaning fluid is present in a room, even though you're not aware of that cleaning fluid being there, it does have an effect subtle effect on your behavior. You'll be a little bit more tidy, as it turns out. We'll talk about examples of taking a sweat sample from somebody who's put in a fearful situation. Not that fearful. You know, they're on a roller coaster and a sweat sample is taken from them. That when you are presented that sweat sample at unconscious levels, at levels below your threshold, it can have a very subtle effect on how you rate pictures or something like that. Other examples are from sleep research, that in fact you do smell things in your sleep, and that can have an effect on your dreaming state and on your ability to kind of solidify memories that you've had, memories of things that have happened during a day. Okay, so that's one thing that dreaming does. We know that dreaming helps consolidate memories. It can help you study, as we'll see. But it can be, that kind of consolidation can be enhanced by presenting a smell to somebody as they're sleeping, which is clearly an unconscious example of smelling, right? It's an unconscious example of scent. But it will kind of interact with how your brain can incorporate memories from that day. And then we will talk about one of the kind of most, I guess, controversial, well, I think it's getting less controversial, topics in unconscious smell, and that has to do with something called pheromones. The idea that we secrete a type of odor that is unconsciously detected by other people that can have biological effects on us. One of the most kind of recognized examples of this is through women who are cohabitating in dorms who have their menstrual cycles in train, or we say this in train, or kind of match up. Maybe you've noticed this before when you were first in the dorms, or you went away to camp or something like that. All of a sudden, the women who came in and had, you know, subtly different dates, you know, for their menstruation, they start syncing up. And that's something we've known about animals for a long time, but it also occurs for people. So let me get the terms down here for you. It's on this, the posted slides, but the idea is that you're using subliminal odors all the time. So this will be a field of research that tests smell, but smell that we are never aware of. You use subliminal odors all the time. You can smell things like fear and danger, like somebody who's just been on a roller coaster. That fact that they've been scared. It has, again, subtle unconscious effects on you, but it's something that your brain is sensitive to. The odor of others can affect your mood and subtly your arousal. So we'll talk about this. This is again a controversial topic with regard to pheromones, right? The idea that you can smell somebody else's arousal of various types, and that might affect your arousal. Before you get scared of anything having to do with that, I will say it is a very subtle effect, but it's an interesting, measurable effect nonetheless. You're not going to be coerced into having a romantic relationship with somebody you don't want to have a real romantic relationship with, but it does add somebody else's smell, which you are using unconsciously, can add to the romance of a situation. Okay. All right. We'll go through two chapters, two nice, fun discussions on smell, and then we'll go into taste. And I think you'll find the taste research really interesting as well. As I said, I hadn't taught a lot about taste. I hadn't done a lot of research on taste until I wrote the book. And again, I found it fascinating. And what you find about one of the most interesting aspects of taste is that very little of your experience of flavor is actually based on what your tongue is doing. That it turns out taste is basically your most, I guess what we could say is multi-sensory sense. That taste is influenced by what you're smelling at the time, but much more than that. And we'll see through some really nice demonstrations. Here, let me turn off the sound of this. Sorry about that. These are people that are in a restaurant that is completely black on the inside. Hopefully you're able to see this a little bit. Hopefully you can see at least part of the video. The question is whether people who are put into a dark restaurant, do they taste their food more vividly, or does it taste more bland? And we'll talk about the answer to that question. I went to this restaurant and had this experience myself, which I write about in the book. And I'll tell you why this occurs, how this occurs, and some interesting things about it. Okay? And then we'll talk about experiments that show that not only does what you see and smell have an influence on how you experience flavor, but what you hear has an influence on how you experience flavor. How loud the crunching of something is will determine how flavorful it is for you. And it's something that individuals or companies that are make food are very, very aware of. They know that not only the sight and smell of food is important as they create it, but how loud it sounds as you're eating it is something that plays an important role in how much you enjoy it. So you taste what you see, hear, touch, and smell. Again, I think taste is one of the most multi-sensory of all your senses. And you taste what you expect. And so whether you think something that looks like an ice cream is actually an ice cream, or maybe it's some sort of cheese or something like that, what you are told to expect will have a strong influence on how you taste it. And then we will spend a nice chunk of time talking about these wine connoisseurs who have learned to distinguish aspects of wine that they, most of us would think would be completely foreign to us. So, not only whether it's a red wine or a white wine, I think I could probably tell that. I'm not a wine drinker, but I think I probably could tell that. But if it's a red wine, is it a Zinfandel? Is it a Merlot? Probably regular wine drinkers can do that. But these experts can do a lot more. They can tell you what part of the world it was bottled in, what type of vineyard, what type of soil the grape was grown in, and what year the grape was harvested. different years are going to have different seasons. They're going to have different temperatures. And these wine connoisseurs can tell you, all these different details from sipping a wine. And it turns out this is a great example of perceptual expertise, as I kind of suggested before, because they're able to do this from actually sitting down with books and learning how the grapes are grown and learning how different soils have influences on the types of grapes and how healthy they are. And then, how long the winter months were, was it a cold winter? Was it a mild winter? How that has a bearing on the taste of the grape in the wine. And they can therefore, make conclusions about the year the grape was bottled, the wine was bottled in, based on being able to infer what the seasons were like that year. It's just amazing stuff. You'll meet a wine connoisseur who was kind of had to teach himself how to do this because of the rank he was interested in achieving as a wine expert. Really, really cool. Okay, and then what we'll do is we'll move to touch. And we will start talking about touch by going through a really interesting example of touch, having to do with being able to perceive speech through touch. And you'll meet somebody I interviewed. His name's Rick Joy, and there he is on the right here. And he was pretty much completely blind and completely deaf from birth. Okay, he had a little hearing, I guess, for a year or so. He was blind at birth, but then he had a little hearing for a year or so. But then he lost that completely too, from meningitis. You might know a little bit about another person like this. This is Helen Keller. You'll learn about Helen Keller. You'll be seeing a really interesting video about Helen Keller. Same situation, blind and deaf from birth. I believe hers was from rubella, I think. But both of these individuals learned to communicate with people by touching faces, by touching the face of the person as they were talking with them. Now, both of these folks had tutors, teachers originally, that taught them sign language. And when you're blind and deaf, you can read sign language by touching the fingers of the person that's signing. Okay, so if I know sign language and I'm using American Sign Language and I'm finger spelling or something like that, a blind deaf person can hold my hand and determine what I'm signing. But clearly, most of the people that these individuals, these blind deaf people encounter, don't know sign language, so they have to find another way to communicate with them. And the way they do so is by touching the face. And what I'm going to talk about is that, yes, they can do it. Rick Joy touched my face for 2 hours so I could interview him, and I barely had to repeat myself. He was really good at this. That's not something you could do right away. But it is something you could learn to do if you wanted to and had about 100 hours of practice. Okay? You would be as good as Rick Joy and Helen Keller. But even without practice, you could do a little bit of this. You could distinguish between different vowels like ba and va. Or not vowels, I'm sorry, syllables. Ba, va. You could distinguish between ba sounds and va sounds and da sounds by touching the lips of a person. Maybe it would take you a few minutes to be certain that you could feel the differences, but you could do it. And the cool thing is that once you're able to get that after, say, 3 or 4 minutes, your brain can kind of soak in that information and integrate it with the speech you'd be hearing and lip reading too. So you can perceive speech through touching faces. At first, nowhere near as good as Rick Joy or Helen Keller, but your brain can do a little of it right away, and it treats it as real speech information right away as well. Okay, so we are at 20 after 11, and what I think I'd like to do here is take a little break. So let me stop sharing and see. It looked like there were a few questions, so let me answer these questions first. Stan Lee's Superhumans, yes. So Kimberly asked, was Dan, I think you're assuming that was written at 1046, so I assume you're talking about Daniel Kish. Was he? He might have been on that. Daniel has been on many shows demonstrating his echolocation skills. And there's other folks that have learned to do this too. Brian Bushway is somebody else I went bike riding with. And you'll see that he's able to do what Daniel did. So sometimes Brian is on these shows. Not sure who it was, but I'll take a look at that. But yeah, the Stan Lee show is very cool. I don't think that's on anymore. There's other shows that have been like this. I think there's something called you'll see other shows that the BBC has shows, PBS has shows. I think there's something called 100 Humans or something that does a little bit of this sort of thing. So we'll see demonstrations from these shows. Some of them are really fun. Beast River asks, would you say it is likely he has better balance, coordination, kinesthetic awareness than sighted people? Daniel Kish. Very good question. I will say he certainly has better touch and hearing. We know that for certain because of different tests he's been through. Whether he has better balance is a good question. I could ask him. I will ask him. I know Daniel well. I know the people that have done research on Daniel well. I can ask if they've ever tested that sort of thing. It could very well be that he has balance skills that most sighted people don't have, or at least has learned to compensate for his loss of sight, so he has equal balance skills, where if somebody were blindfolded that's used to using sight for balance, they aren't able to do that. Okay, good question. Any other questions at this point? Okay, well, let's take a break then. Let's take about a 7-8 minute break. I'll come back at 11:30. It's 11:23 now, and I'll come back at 11:30, and then we'll continue with our discussion. Okay, so I'm going to mute myself and blank myself out. Hey, everybody. I'm on the beach now. Okay, we'll continue. Are there any questions before we do? Any questions? We'll take another break in a few minutes and do a actual poll question that's going to be on the exam. But just wanted to see if we got any, we needed to answer anything before we continue. Oh, what beach? Oh, let's see. That's a good question. Can anyone tell? Anyone who knows beaches well tell? Does it look like Hawaii, maybe? Oh, yeah, I think it's Hawaii. That's my guess. Oh, boy. Wouldn't it be nice to be there right now? Oh. Anyway, okay. So let's continue with our discussion. We doing okay? Yeah. Oh, people are saying it's Hawaii. Yeah. Do you know what beach in Hawaii? People know it? Is it Honolulu somewhere? No? Okay. All right. Anyway, good. Let's continue then, and we will go back to exactly where we were. Cool. Okay, looks like we recorded during that time, that break time. I didn't have a break last time I taught the course, so, or 10-minute break. When, I guess there will be a 10-minute pause in the video when you look at it after it's uploaded, just so you're aware of that. Okay, so what we're doing still is we're just continuing our discussion of the course topics. And we just moved into touch, which you'll start learning about after the midterm, probably. I believe the midterm covers through taste and smell as well as hearing. So you'll learn about this stuff after the midterm mostly. You just learn that you can perceive speech from touching faces, but you can do a lot much more with touch and faces, as it turns out. There's a literature now that suggests that we recognize faces and facial expression from touch, and it's a really interesting literature because what it suggests is that the brain region that we long thought was associated with visual perception of faces is actually also sensitive to our touching of faces, so the same region. In fact, you're going to learn about patients who've had brain injury and have lost their ability to recognize faces easily, called prosopagnosia. And as it turns out, people with prosopagnosia not only have trouble recognizing faces through seeing, but they also have trouble recognizing faces through touch, which is kind of related to what we were discussing before as one of the major themes of the course, which is kind of the multisensory nature of perception. This area that we long thought was responsible for seeing faces is actually involved in perceiving faces, even through means that we never thought we could do before, which is touch. It really cares about what the face identity is. It doesn't care whether it's through sight or touch in this case. And then we're going to talk about a literature concerning being able to touch things, feel things through without actually touching them. And here's a nice example of that. Okay, here's my book again. If I were to close my eyes and then you say, and hold my fingers like this, and then you put the book here, and then ask me how big the book is, or could I use my other hand to grab the book right in the middle, I would probably be okay. Yeah, that's not too bad. All right. And so what this suggests is I'm actually, in a sense, feeling something about the entire book, even though I'm just touching the book with a very small, in a very small part of the object. And you'll find that the ways that this can be done get much more sophisticated. So that's what I mean here by feeling things without touching them. And then we'll talk about tool use, and we'll meet a really interesting guy who teaches fly fishing, right? You've probably done some fishing before, or you know what fishing's about at least. Fly fishing is a kind of very different sport. It's not this type I did when I was a kid, just kind of dropping the line in the water and pulling out a fish. It involves a lot of strategy and a lot of technique, where the line has to be thrown in a very specific position. The line doesn't drop to the bottom with a weight. It kind of floats. It's a plastic line that kind of floats on top of the water. And these folks have to be very skilled to be able to do what they're doing. By the way, they're fishing in a river. So much of what they're doing, they can't do by sight. They have to do by touch. And as you'll learn from this fly fisherman, he's also an instructor, is that he can feel so many details about what the fish is doing and about what the fish, about details about the fish itself, its gender, its size, of course, its breed, whether it's a rock bass or a black bass or something like that, how old it is based on how it moves. And you can tell all this from just feeling vibrations in the rod itself. So this would be an example of what we call proxy touch, or touching things through tools. In this case, the tool is this big fishing rod. But this is something we're doing all the time when we're writing on paper with a pen or using a tool from our toolbox. We are touching things without directly having contact with our body by touching things through tools. And the brain does some very interesting things to kind of make room for the tool, almost as if it becomes part of the body. And it happens very, very quickly, you'll see. There'll be some fun demonstrations to show you this in discussion section as well. And speaking of being able to feel things through proxy or through other objects, we'll talk about the fact that, like a spider, how spiders kind of sit on webs and they can tell something about, when a fly has been ensnared, as well as where the fly is. That's something that you can do too by feeling how ropes vibrate. You can tell how big something is, and you can tell where it's located along the rope's length, just from feeling vibrations that are occurring right there in your hand. Okay, so all this is suggesting a touch system that's much more sophisticated than we usually think of what touch is about. Our skin being deformed by objects. We're talking about levels of touch that go deep in the nervous system and can be detected by very sophisticated aspects of our brain. And then we're going to continue talking about touch in another context. And this is a very important context. And it has to do with this notion of plasticity, of how the brain changes with experience and how the brain changes when it's deprived of a modality. So we're going to meet this fascinating guy, John Bramblett, who is a blind artist. There he is painting. And he actually lost his sight later. Many of the folks we'll be talking about that have been sensory deprived have lost their sense early in life. John didn't lose his sense of sight until I think, was in his early 20s, and only then decided to become a painter, kind of as a way to, kind of prove that he could still do anything. It was kind of an interesting act of defiance, I think. But he's become a very successful painter and an art teacher too, which we'll talk about. A really interesting guy. And he paints through feeling the canvas, through feeling the paint, and through feeling how the brush is affected as it kind of is pulled through different types of paint. He can tell what type of paint he's using based on the resistance of the brush as it's going through the paint. It's really interesting. You'll learn a lot about him. There he is, painting. We'll see a whole video of John going through how he does this skill. But what you find with individuals who've lost their sight and have kind of enhanced their ability to touch is that the visual regions of the brain, there's some flexibility, right? The regions of their brain that are doing a lot of seeing for us are actually rededicated to touch and to some degree hearing. And so this is going to be a great opportunity to understand this notion of plasticity in the brain by understanding how the brain areas kind of get reassigned to compensate for a sensory loss. And so John can't see, obviously, so his ability to touch has been enhanced through his experience, allowing his, what we would normally call the visual brain areas to now, do better, have a better touch skill than those of us who aren't blind have. So we're going to see that that's true of sensory impaired individuals such as John Bramblett and Daniel Kish. But we're also going to see that this is something that our brain is ready to do for all of us. We'll learn about some experiments that involve blindfolding sighted individuals for as little as a few hours. So if you're blindfolded, I don't know if you would ever have an experience in your life where you've been blindfolded for a few hours, but if you were, your brain would start kind of reorganizing itself to devote more of its energy to the other senses. So this plasticity, this kind of change in how the brain is working can happen fairly quickly. It does revert after you take the blindfold off, certainly, but the fact that it can go back and forth like that so quickly is a really interesting discovery and has a lot of implications for how your brain learns new material, which we'll be talking a lot about. So your visual brain, even somebody who has not had a sensory impairment such as yourself, your visual brain is ready to touch, which is really interesting. Then we'll talk about how that fact, how the touch kind of enhancement has led to devices that have been designed for the blind that might allow them to get around a cluttered environment, such as my beach right here. It's fairly cluttered with coconuts on the ground. These devices would kind of take in visual images. These mechanical devices would take in visual images, and in some cases, actually impart the visual image onto the tongue through little sensors. So these are things that have been invented for the blind to get around. Somebody just sent me from last quarter's course, one of the students just sent me a video of somebody who is, I guess, devised a device for the blind using the newest iPad. I didn't know about this. My son just ordered one of these new iPads. I guess not only are there cameras in it, and you know, what's typically in your iPhone and your iPad that allows the system to kind of focus on different parts of the scene, but there's a very sophisticated kind of, I guess you could almost say, radar system that kind of sends out light, and then it kind of like, you know, echolocation almost, sends out light, and then that light bounces back, and it does it at many different angles. And in fact, it's exactly how these new automobiles that have these sensors that can detect the distance of different objects, and, you know, can kind of help you with, you know, the safety of your car. It can help you brake and you know, allow for, you know, kind of dynamic speed control and that sort of thing. Those have been built into these new iPads. I can't wait to see it when my kid gets mine in a few weeks. But what he did is he made use of this guy to devise a new electronical device for the blind. And we'll talk about how that's done, and whether or not the blind's, I guess, kind of enhanced sense of touch can be utilized to help them better get around in a natural cluttered environment. Okay. Because what you learn is that the more you touch, the more your brain changes. So the brain of a blind person will change by virtue of being deprived of sight. But for all of us, if we learn to use tools, you know, if you you know, learn to crochet, if you learn to you know, do woodworking, the more you use a tool and the more you're using your sense of touch in that way, the more your brain is going to change. And it's not something, you know, it's not something that's restricted to children like I was taught. It's, you know, when a you know, elderly person decides to, you know, learn a musical instrument in their retirement, their brains, their touch brains will change to the degree that a young person's touch brains will change. It's not, you know, this is something that constantly goes on, that we've learned about this idea of neuroplasticity. We'll learn some of the mechanics, and this is where the course will get a tiny bit technical. We'll learn how short-term changes in the brain, so for example, like being blindfolded for 3 hours, can then induce long-term plasticity if you decide, if you're willing to be blindfolded for, you know, many weeks or something like that. Or if, you know, if you're like John Bramblett and have lost your sight and no longer, can use vision at all, the short-term plasticity that occurred when he first lost his sight with his sense of touch became long-term plasticity by being visually impaired for months and of course the rest of his life. That short-term plasticity becomes long-term plasticity, and science now knows how that occurs with your brain and how neurons communicate with each other differently as we change from short-term kind of flexibility in the brain to long-term flexibility in the brain. It's really interesting, and it gets a little technical, but I think you'll follow it without a problem. And then based on those concepts, we're going to also talk to somebody who's lost a limb, lost an appendage. It's a sad story, but he's doing okay now, as it turns out. He had the lower part of his leg amputated because of diabetes, and I was able to interview him. He was very gracious and was willing to talk to me about his experience of losing a limb, having his limb amputated when he was in his 50s. It had just occurred, by the way. Ben Curry is his name. Really nice guy. And he was very willing to share his experience. And you'll find it really, really, I think, illuminating. He has what's very common with new amputees. He has what's called phantom sensation. It's not pain. He has a little pain, but it's more of a discomfort. It is a pain or discomfort in the limb that's lost. So he lost the lower part of his leg. He has pain in the toes of the foot he no longer has. And we used to have no idea what was going on with this phantom pain or this phantom sensation, but now we know a lot more about it because of our understanding with regard to plasticity in the nervous system. So you'll learn about this and you'll be able to better understand what's going on with phantom pain and phantom sensation with your newly acquired knowledge of neuroplasticity. And this knowledge that's acquired by science has learned to help people like Ben Curry better deal with this sort of phantom pain and phantom sensation. So we have a very kind of clear applied kind of function of learning about the concept of plasticity being used to help people. And then we're going to see some very interesting research that suggests that you can actually induce plasticity not only from the loss of a sense or the kind of gaining of a new skill, but actually being able to concentrate very carefully on something. Let me just give you an example. I don't know if you know what Tai Chi is. Maybe some of your parents do Tai Chi. It's become really popular over the last month or so, or the last few months because of quarantine. It's one of those exercises that middle-aged older people do. It's often seen in medication commercials. You see people kind of doing this kind of dance where it looks like half martial arts, half dance sort of thing. That's Tai Chi. What you find with people who practice Tai Chi is that they are taught to concentrate very, very intently on what their fingers are doing. Okay, now their fingers aren't supposed to really touch anything. In fact, they're supposed to be kind of pointed out away from the body and kind of like this. But they're told concentrate on your fingers as if your fingers have like beams of light sent out. And try to kind of sweep as you're moving from one direction to another. You're sweeping over, the scene that's in front of you. Try to keep it as smooth as possible, almost like your fingers would be painting over the scene in front of you. And what it does is it really kind of helps them concentrate on keeping their fingers as consistently in position as possible. But what you find also about these people is that even though their fingers aren't actually ever touching things during this rehearsal, during this practice, their sense of touch is improved. Their sense of touch is improved in their fingertips as if they were actually touching things that they were kind of gliding their hands over. And so what it suggests is that plasticity isn't just something that comes from either sensory deprivation or practice touching things literally. It can be practice of touching things mentally that can induce this sort of plasticity. That's cool. That's really cool. We'll learn more about this. I want to, I want to kind of make sure that it doesn't kind of fall into the idea of positive, the power of positive thinking. You can think your brain into something different. In some ways you really can, but there are limits to that. Okay, so I want to make sure that we're very clear on that, and we will learn about that as we go through. Hate to be a buzzkill, but yes, your brain can change. I mean, your way you're thinking can change your brain, certainly, but there are limits to how that works. Okay. Then we're going to move into sight. And of course, we're going to spend a lot of time on sight. That's probably our most dominant, at least conscious sense. And we're going to talk about one of my favorite topics, and that's face perception, because I think it really reveals our expertise as perceivers. It reveals that we can really detect such subtleties in faces that actually it's become a problem for certain industries. And here we're going to, here we're going to go through one of the most interesting interviews I think I had a chance to do. Let me give you a tiny bit of background. We'll talk about this in detail, of course, when we go through the chapter. But that is an image from a movie called The Polar Express. You guys know that movie? I think most people your age know it. They do show it, I think, regularly at Christmas time. I have trouble getting through it. Maybe you like it. Maybe it's one of your favorites. But I think regardless, you and I would agree that there is something a little creepy about the way the characters look. Do you agree? There's something in the eyes, maybe, or something. And you might know how this movie was made, that actually, especially in the case of Tom Hanks, the actor who actually voices a number of characters in the movie, they spent a lot of time and money tracking his movements on his face and his body and all that sort of thing. And still, there's something very creepy about the way the characters look in this movie. It came out, by the way, just as an aside, it came out at the same time that movie, The Incredibles, the first Incredibles came out, same night. And it's, if I asked you which movie you like better, I think you'd probably say Incredibles, and there's many reasons for that probably. But if you look at the reviews, you'll say The Incredibles, they'll concentrate on the story and how funny it was and stuff like that. When you look at the reviews for The Polar Express from the time it came out, people will say it is creepy. And it's creepy for a very interesting reason. It's creepy for a reason that suggests that we are so sensitive to faces that when faces are made to look real but don't look real enough, they seem creepy to us. And no one knows that better than this guy I interviewed, Stephen Poe. What he suggested, what he did was he worked on this problem in a number of different contexts. Maybe you're aware of this if you're a gamer. Sometimes video game characters are especially, kind of guilty of this. They look creepy. What Stephen Poe did, knowing the history of why it looks creepy when you try to make somebody look real but they don't look real enough, is that he came up with a solution that allowed him to make a character in a movie called Benjamin Button. I think it's called The Incredible Life of Benjamin Button. It's a movie that stars Brad Pitt, and in that movie, Brad Pitt ages in reverse. And if you've ever seen the movie, the first half of that movie, you actually never see Brad Pitt. You see a computer animated Brad Pitt. But even people who know about computer animation and do it in the field didn't realize that it was computer animated. They thought that they had taken Brad Pitt's face and just superimposed it on somebody else's body, an older person's body, a smaller person's body, that sort of thing. But no, he was computer animated from the beginning. So this guy, Steve Poe, was able to solve the problem of these kind of zombie-looking characters, but it was not easy. Okay. One of the great reasons that one of the best parts about doing the interview is I did the interview just by chance the week after he won the Academy Award for the Benjamin Button film. And his office was just, everybody in his office were just flying. They were so happy. And he told me how much work they had to put into it in order to make Brad Pitt's character look so good in the first half of this movie and not look like, not look like this sort of thing, okay? What he knew, what Stephen Poe knew he was working against was this, that, what should be on there is that you're a face perceiving expert is the same thing, actually. That we are face perceiving experts and our brains are supremely sensitive to faces. Supremely sensitive to faces. There's probably no stimulus in our world to which our brain is more sensitive to than faces. Faces convey so much information, of course, about identity and gender, but then things like attractiveness and reproductive fitness and intent, whether someone seems angry towards us. All this stuff has to be picked up quickly and efficiently and be processed so quickly that our brains have become supremely sensitive to faces, which is why we are creeped out by things like this, by the Polar Express faces. But then we'll learn about other things, other ways that our brains are sensitive to faces. So it's not just seeing the skin and the shape of a body or shape of a face or the color of the eyes that allows us to recognize who we're looking at, but also the way a person's face moves. Okay, we'll learn that if you take away all the other information, like the skin and the eyes and everything, and you just reduce an image to how a face moves, okay, you're able to recognize people that way too. And then we'll talk about the fact that when it comes to expressions, we actually use our own face. This is related to this issue of Botox and not being able to perceive other people's expressions. Our own faces are used to perceive other people's expressions. If our own faces are constrained in some way, say through Botox injections, then we're not as good at recognizing expressions as we would be if they weren't, okay? And then this, I think you're going to find this really interesting. Some people find this a little controversial, but I think that there's enough there that it's worth talking about. You were taught to not judge a book by its cover, to not judge a people based on their appearance. But you probably know we do it anyway. And this, by the way, this is something completely different from, judging people by their ethnicity and race and all that sort of stuff. That's of course, that's terribly important. But we're talking about now looking at a person's face, regardless of their race, regardless of their ethnicity, and making inferences about what their personality is like. You were taught not to do that. There's no reason. You don't know about about somebody's character until you talk with them. You get to know them a little bit, which is very true. But your brain has been set up to make judgments based on things like somebody's facial appearance. And as it turns out, when we make those kind of knee-jerk assumptions about people, there's an element with which we are correct. It's subtle. And of course, you should never make a kind of a blanket judgment about somebody just from looking at their face. But the fact that you can, and you do, and you're not always terribly wrong is something that's interesting and something that scientists are trying to understand. So you're not great at it and don't rely on it, certainly, but there is an element to which you can perceive something about a person's personality from just looking at their face, even if their face is neutral. Not smiles, so you probably can tell something about me from my smile and my weird facial expressions, but if my face were neutral, or anybody's face were neutral, your brain can't help but make judgments, and in some subtle ways, it can be right. We'll talk about that. And then we'll talk a lot about attractiveness and reproductive potential and how that is signaled in attractiveness and youthfulness, and how that's had a bearing on culture and adornment and makeup and all that sort of stuff. Your exceptionally face-sensitive brain has been designed to pick up on all of those dimensions too. I think you'll find that stuff really interesting. And then based on some of this stuff we'll be talking about with regard to face perception, for example, this idea that you use your facial expressions your own face, to perceive facial expressions, we will then move in and talk a lot about directly this idea of imitation. And what we'll talk about, oh shoot, I didn't mean to do this. Okay, let me do this anyway. Yeah, okay, I'll start it off like this. All right, magic time. Now, this is not me doing a magic trick. This is somebody else doing a magic trick. But it is the reason I got into magic. I was never into magic until I wrote the book, and I'll tell you the whole story there. But this is a demonstration of how magic works. It's a crappy little magic trick, but it's more of like an experimental demonstration. But how magic works to make use of your tendency to imitate. Okay, so look at this picture, look at this little video, and it's not going to look great on your computer, I realize. I'm sorry about this, but you'll get a sense of how this works anyway. Here's a magician. He's going to throw up a ball. There you go. Ta-da! Okay, the ball disappears. Now, I doubt this worked for you because I know it's really staggered. It's not a smooth video. I wish Zoom did a better job at showing videos. This is the best we can do. When people in an experiment are asked where the ball goes on that third throw, they'll say, I don't know, he threw it up and it landed on a shelf above where he was standing that the camera's not showing. I guess one of the most common things people said was on that third throw, he did throw it up, but there's somebody up there on a ladder above where he is. You can't see the ladder, you can't see the person, and they caught the ball. So the assumption was the ball was thrown up on the last throw. It might not have worked for you, that's okay. But if you were in a real experiment and seeing the video smooth, that would be your tendency as a response. Here's the same thing, but there's going to be a little bit of a change, and let's see if you would feel the same way. Same guy throwing the ball up. 1, 2, 3. Now, when subjects are asked where the ball is in that situation, these are a whole group of new subjects now are asked where the ball is in that situation, they say, oh, that's not much of a trick. He just kept it in his hand. You may have noticed there was a difference between these two videos. When he was throwing the ball up this time, for this video, on the third throw, he continued to look at where the ball might have been if he actually threw it up. So it was, do I have a ball here? I do. You're lucky. Stay right there and enjoy the beach. Okay, let me see if I can do it. I'm going to pull my own image in so I can see if I'm going to do this right. Can you see this? 1, 2. It's a foam ball. It's hard to catch. Oh, I should use, I can't use the beeping ball because it's got a pin in it. 1, 2. Okay, that's what the video on the left showed. The video on the right showed this. 1, 2. Okay, look where my eyes are here. Okay, I'm looking to where the ball is. In the first video, okay, what he did is he followed where the ball would have gone if he actually threw it up. So what's happening here is that your attention is following his attention. And in fact, if I were to measure the gaze of your eye, okay, if in fact, I had a little camera looking at your eye, for this version of the trick, okay, you would follow where his eyes went. So your eyes would go up on that third throw, even though the ball wasn't going up, okay? On this one, it would not. And so what you find here is that, oops, sorry. Your gaze imitates, okay, other people's gaze. I mean, where somebody else is looking, okay, will imitate, you will imitate with your own gaze. And magicians know this. Where's the ball? Okay, I'm not going to do this for you. I'm going to wait until we go through this and I can do my trick for you. I was going to give it away, but I'm not going to give it away. It's not going to be that hard, but But magicians know this. So when they're looking at a hand like this, okay, they're looking at an open hand, they know that even if your eyes don't move that way, your attention will move that way. Your attention can't help but follow where somebody else's attention goes. Okay, so I look here as the magician, you look there as the magician, as the audience, and I can do something secret with this hand, right? I can hide something with this hand. And it works really, really well. And magicians kind of implicitly know this. You know, they know that where they look is where the audience is going to, if not literally look with their eyes, at least their attention will go there as well. And that imitative gaze actually is something that in many cases can help you perceive. So why would we imitate the gaze? Why would we imitate the attention of another person? Well, if there's something that's going to be threatening to us and somebody sees it and you don't, it's a good thing to know, right? So if I'm hanging out in Kenya, like on a safari, and I'm walking around, a tree to I don't know, look to see what's in the tree, and my guide is sitting there, and all of a sudden I see my guide's eyes widen and look behind me. You know I'm going to look behind me. It could be a lion, it could be an elephant, it could be a rhinoceros, something that could be very threatening. And it makes sense for my brain to be sensitive to where somebody else's attention is going to go. Magicians make use of this. And they will, wait for the audience's attention to go someplace and then do something secret with their hand. So we're going to learn all about this. We're going to learn all about, We're going to learn all about imitation. We're going to learn, as I said, about how imitation helps us facilitate our interactions. We're going to learn about how imitation also facilitates our perceptual skill, how it actually makes us a better perceiver. And this is something that I personally am interested in, and I've been working in my lab on this sort of thing, how imitation allows you to perceive things more accurately, kind of with more fine detail by imitating. It's really interesting. It's something that kind of sometimes coaches will tell you, that imitative learning makes you not only better at performing an action, it makes you better at perceiving somebody else's action, which is, something coaches know probably, something magicians know, but now science is beginning to understand. Okay. What else? This is where we'll be talking about this idea of a mirror system, because we're going to learn that there are parts of the brain that we never noticed before, parts of the brain that we thought were set aside for creating an action, for initiating an action, say grabbing to something. But these parts of the brain actually have double duty. They not only are used when we initiate a movement, okay, Rosenblum, grab this remote control. There I go. Part of my brain did that. And we always thought that that part of the brain was just for movement initiation. But now we know, over the last 15 years or so, now we know that that part of the brain is also being used to perceive other people perform the same action. So that part of the brain lights up when I grab something, but if you now grab something, somebody who's live in front of me grabs something, that same part of the brain will be activated. So in a way, there are parts of the brain that we never had noticed before share acting and perceiving. And as it turns out, that's probably the basis of all this imitation that we're doing, and the fact that the imitation helps us with our social interactions and our perceptual skill. And then I think I'll have this is in the book, but I think I'll have Serena discuss this stuff. What happens when we synchronize? What happens when we sing together like in church? What happens when we dance together like at a rave, or a rave at a church? What happens when we synchronize our movements? And you'll find that there's some very magical things that happen, not only socially, not only with our kind of social interactions, but perceptually what happens when we synchronize our emotions. I'll leave that for Serena to tell you all about. And then we'll go on to the final part of our discussion, which has to do with multisensory perception. And in here we'll get into some of the research I do in my lab too. That it is one of those things that you just never really knew about I think some of you might now be a little bit more aware of this over the last few months. I'd be interested to get your input. I think this is true. I'm getting comments from a lot of my middle-aged friends about this. A lot of us have started to notice that because we're wearing masks on our face, that we are understanding less what people are saying, and well, that would make sense because they're quieter because there's there's something covering up the mouth, so they would be quieter. But it has very little to do with that, as it turns out. It has a lot to do with being able to see the lips, and in fact, there are now a number of companies that are producing masks like this, like you see there. I just got this yesterday because I thought it'd be fun to have and it'd be fun to share. Now, let's see, how's this working? It doesn't look bad. It's a little shiny because of the light, but I was worried that it might fog up. Does it fog up? Let's see. Testing one. It's not, here, I think the problem is the green screen thing's not picking it up well. But you can trust me that I did this with my family last night. This is the type of nerd I am. I wanted to see if they understood me better. So I kind of talked softly with this type of mask and then the regular type of mask that most of us wear. And in fact, they said, yeah, they could actually understand me better if they could see my lips. And this is, I think, especially true with those of us that are maybe a little bit older and our hearing isn't as good as it used to be. And so, in fact, yes, we do lip read. We lip read all the time, not without sound, but looking at a face, looking at the lips move, looking at the tongue, if we can see it sometimes, helps us understand what a person is saying. And you'll see some really kind of cool examples of this. I have a couple of examples that I can show you right now, but I don't know how it's going to work. This is a famous example, and I'll post another example of this called the McGurk effect. Maybe some of you have seen it on some of these shows. Maybe it's in the Stanley show. Maybe it's on other kind of sciencey shows that you might have seen. But this is a mouth that's going to articulate different syllables. And I'm going to turn up the sound so you folks can hear this. I believe the sound works okay through you folks. Let's see. You're going to see him articulate different syllables, and I'm going to stop the video. It's just on a loop. I'm going to stop the video, and I'm going to, well, I'll ask you if you heard what I heard. Here we go.
Ba.
Yeah.
Ba. Ba. Ba.
So, okay, I am very aware that the audio and video might have been a little asynchronous, but hopefully you're able to hear something. And if you do, and you were able to see and hear some of those videos synchronized, like I am here, it looks great where I am, that you might have heard ba, va, da, and da. And can I see thumbs up here? No. Can you guys hear this? So I'm not kind of, where's the, I don't even see this. Okay, hold on. Let me go through the talk and then I'll find out if it worked later. It's okay. We have other examples we can show later on. What I'm going to do now, though, assuming that you could hear this, is that I'm going to replay it. And what I want you to do now is look away and just listen.
Ba. 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 Ba.
Okay, let me see something here. Okay, let me see what the chat looks like. When I wasn't looking at my screen, I heard stop the first time, but after I heard ba. Okay, so it's working a little bit, right? Cool. Thank you for telling me that, Kimberly. Let's do this again. And what I'd like you to do is maybe start by not looking at it and then open your eyes and see if you end up hearing something different based on what you're seeing.
Ba. Ba. ba, ba,
And what should be happening is, I won't go into too much details on this, too many details right now on it, but you should be hearing something different if you're looking at the face speaking than if you're not looking at the face speaking. If you're not looking, you'll know that it's ba, ba, ba over and over again. If you're looking at it though, what you're seeing, which is ba, va, da, da, is affecting what you think you're hearing. And this is a very, very well-known and thoroughly studied phenomenon, some of which was done in my lab, called the McGurk effect. And what it suggests is that our brain will kind of automatically integrate what we're seeing with what we're hearing. Okay, we'll learn a lot more about this because it provides kind of the initiative to understand the brain in a very different way as a multisensory sort of device. Okay, and your brain, as it turns out, the part of your brain that is normally reactive to hearing speech is actually reactive in the same way to seeing speech. So even though you're not a good lip reader, you can't lip read very much on its own without some sort of sound, okay? To the degree that you can use visual speech information, your auditory brain uses it as if it's hearing the sound. That type of phenomenon has changed all of perceptual psychology, and we are now rethinking the brain as a multi-sensory sort of device, as we discussed. And then finally, we're going to talk about how seeing the way a face moves as it's speaking can tie into how we can recognize not only what's being said, like, as we're, allowing people to see our mouths with these sorts of masks, but also it's going to allow us to recognize the person who's saying it. So again, we're going to talk about a technique where we get rid of everything like the skin and the eyes and the face structure and isolate just the movement. I'll let you know it's little movements of white points that are capturing the specific movement of a specific person. And that's enough for us to be able to recognize who that person is. Okay. All right, I realize it's been a while since we took a little break, so let's take a break. We have one more slide for the introduction, but let's take a break now and do a polling question. Okay. First, are there any questions on anything we've gone through? Hey, let me know if did the McGurk effect work? Say yes or no. It kind of, what the idea was that what you saw would affect what you heard. Did it work on you when you saw it? You can be honest. Yeah, somebody put yes, yes. Oh, thank you, Joanna. Thank you, Aya. Good, okay. Are there any questions or anything we've been through yet? I know this is an introduction, but I thought that sometimes just interesting things come up. I'd be happy to answer anything. Okay, no problem. Let's do a polling question. Now, this is a polling question from yesterday's discussion section. Okay, let me just make it very clear that this is not going to have any bearing on your grade or anything. This is just a way for us to, first of all, practice the type of questions that will be on the exam, and secondly, get a question that's going to be on the exam. So this is from yesterday. And let me read the question for you first, and then I will launch it and give you a minute to respond. As discussed in section yesterday, and I believe most of you were able to go. If not, hopefully you were able to watch the video, or soon will be. Under which circumstance is echolocation accuracy improved? Okay. Is it when the listener is stationary, when they're not moving? When the listener is wearing headphones? Are they good at echolocating when they're wearing some type of headphone? Does it make a difference of whether they're barefoot or not? And we'll see that, well, I won't say anything now. Or D, when the listener is moving. Okay. So I shouldn't have distracted you a little bit with the barefoot thing. Ignore the barefoot thing for now. So under which of those four conditions did you learn yesterday that echolocation was better? When the listener is stationary, when they're wearing headphones, when the listener is barefoot, when the listener is moving. And I'll give you a minute now to respond. Again, it has no bearing on your grade. If you get it wrong, you get it wrong. By the way, I can't see who's responding in what way. It's all anonymous. Everything's completely anonymous. Don't be afraid of answering the question wrong. Do not be afraid of answering the question wrong. I have no idea who is answering it in what way. It doesn't have any bearing on your grade. Listen, I'm going to be embarrassing myself consistently in this class, and I think you'd enjoy it too if you didn't mind embarrassing yourself. No, I'm kidding. You're not going to be embarrassed because I don't know how you're doing. Okay, 45 seconds are gone. Another 15 seconds. It looks like 11 people have responded. Okay, there's 15 online. I don't know if anyone else wants to respond. Okay, there's 12. Okay. You did great. The correct answer is D, that listeners are best when they are moving. That was something that Serena hopefully told you about yesterday. I think she posted a paper that was about that we did in our lab a long time ago. But when listeners have the ability to move forward, they are more accurate at echolocating. Wearing headphones isn't going to be very useful because let's say a majority of echolocation, 99.9%, unless you're in an experiment, you would never wear headphones during echolocation. And barefoot, I put that in there as a possible answer because it's going to turn out to be important, but I will tell you this much, not that important, but the original echolocation discovery worked because people were wearing noisy shoes. So people, even if that was a possible answer that was relevant and it's semi-relevant, that would not be the answer because people are very, very bad at echolocating when they are barefoot. They're much better when they're wearing noisy shoes, as we'll learn about later. So this is a question on your exam. So I'll go ahead and take a screenshot of it since we won't be able to video record it. And the correct answer here is D. Okay. All right, cool. Any questions about that? That's really our first question from an exam. Any questions about that or echolocation? Okay, great. Then let's continue. We've got another, about 25 minutes left for today's class, so we're doing fine. We're almost done with the review, and then we are going to get into echolocation big time. I will tell you all about Daniel Kish. Okay. So the final chapter is basically it's the all of the above chapter where we get into a lot of the nitty gritty on perception, multisensory perception, and how the senses work together. And here, good. The reason I'm showing you this, and I realize that this is not this might not look very good for you folks, but you are probably aware of the very many motion simulator rides that now are at amusement parks. I believe that a majority of the new rides that are being created at Universal Studios are now motion simulator rides, right? They're not making a whole lot of new roller coasters, at least at Universal Studios and Disneyland. I think most of the new rides are like this. And they are very, very effective, right? Much more effective than this demonstration is. I should probably update this and get a better example of it. But it works really, really well. And people will, depending on how the seats move and other things that are going on, will feel like they are moving. I mean, I think what works really well. I'm trying to think, Star Tours works really well. What else? The Simpsons ride, I think, is a blast. They still have the Simpsons ride at Universal Studios. I think that's really fun. Well, it's also hysterically funny, but I think it's a very effective motion simulator ride where, I guess intellectually, consciously, you know that you're not actually moving through the cartoon world, but you really kind of have an exhilaration based on what you're experiencing. And this is, I think, a really cool example of how the senses work together. We will go through an interview with folks that actually design these rides to learn how they do it. And it's really interesting. They have secrets that they shared with me about, ways of getting these sort of demonstrations most effective. And then we'll talk about the science behind this. So there is a literature showing that by moving what we can call the visual field around a person, it can make them feel as if they are moving, to the point where their postures will change. If it's done with young children, toddlers, for example, who, with like 3-4-year-olds that haven't been walking all that long, if you put them in one of these situations in a motion simulator or one of these kind of moving room situations like you're seeing here, the toddler will fall over. I had one of my best friends did his dissertation on knocking over toddlers with motion simulation. Now, it sounds horrible, I know. How could you ever get this approved by the Human Ethics Board? Well, as it turns out, the kids love it, because it's a room that's kind of, it's kind of like a bounce house room, or I think it's even more cushy than a bounce house. It's like all these foam mattresses are on the ground. They're standing on a foam mattress. And as soon as the kind of the visual field around them starts moving, they flop over, they giggle like crazy and go more and more and more and more. They love it. But the way they flop over is very predictable from how the visual field kind of moves around them. And you can learn a lot about the development of balance systems and stuff like that by doing this type of research. So you use multiple senses to get an idea of your balance, where you're located, whether or not you're moving, and even whether or not you're standing still. Even just trying to stand still like this takes a lot of senses, vision of which is one of the most important. Before, somebody asked, interestingly, about whether Daniel Kish has maybe a heightened sense of balance. Certainly, he can't use vision to help. We do, all of us who are seeing, use sight to help our sense of balance. Daniel Kish doesn't have that, so he has to compensate it for it in some ways. He'll probably use sound and things, as we'll learn. But yeah, vision is a very, very important sense for us to know that we're standing still versus moving. And that's why motion simulator rides are so effective. Okay, we'll learn all about the techniques that are used in that case. So even something as simple as trying to stand still in the same spot is affected by multiple senses at the same time. Okay, and then we'll talk about attractiveness. And the fact that attractiveness is something that's not only based on what you see, but is also based on what you hear and even smell. So you're going to learn that there's a correlation between a person's the attractiveness of a person's face, the attractiveness of their voice, and the attractiveness of their odor. Now, there's lots of deviations from all these sorts of things, but there is this really interesting correlation that exists in how attractiveness, things like youthfulness, things like potential genetic health are conveyed through multiple senses at the same time. It's really interesting stuff. And then we'll talk about the research, some of the neurophysiological that really shows that unlike how we used to think about it, say even 15 years ago, the brain isn't really most correctly considered as being divided into regions that are dedicated to the eyes and dedicated to the ears, but that all of these regions can take in multi-sensory information. It is the case that this part of the brain does best with vision, but it takes in hearing and it takes in touch. And this part of the brain here is really good with hearing, probably more accurate with some specifics, but it takes in lip-read information, and it takes in fact, the information that we would get from a face if we touched it. So there is this kind of flexibility in how the sensory brain can take in all this different information. Okay, and then we'll talk about some really interesting stuff. And that's a really silly picture, I realize that. But the reason I chose this is because it really, I think, describes something that we've learned relatively recently about plasticity, that it does not require a sensory loss to occur. Okay, certainly you can induce plasticity in the brain by learning things, but even very minor degradations in a sense will allow the other senses to compensate. So compensation will occur from minor degradations. So this guy that is being pictured here, like me, wears glasses. I bet chances are he's nearsighted like me. Maybe some of you out there are nearsighted as well and wear glasses. If that is the case, I'm not terribly nearsighted. Can I drive? If you see me driving without my glasses, I would move away, but I probably could drive at least for a while without my glasses. I'm not terribly nearsighted, but I'm nearsighted enough so that there's a kind of a fuzzy image on the side, the visual periphery, where my glasses don't correct. Okay, so for people who wear glasses, the central field, and kind of largely the large central field is corrected, but these parts of the visual field, the periphery, aren't corrected. If you have contacts, your whole visual field is pretty much corrected. But for those of us that wear glasses, this part isn't corrected. We're getting a kind of a fuzzy input here for our visual system. And because of that, our hearing, us nearsighted folks that wear glasses, our hearing is better than other folks' hearing. In other words, even though I have a very minor decrement, it's a decrement that's just enough for the auditory system to compensate for the visual distortion I have coming in. And so that's what's meant here by the brain compensating from very minor loss. Okay, quick summary here then before we actually start getting into echolocation seriously. The idea here is that you're perceiving much more than you realize, and we're calling these implicit perceptual abilities because they are subliminal. Now again, we're using subliminal here maybe a little bit differently than how you would have used the term previously, talking about subliminal advertising or something like that. Subliminal means just here that it's below our conscious awareness. It's deeper than our conscious awareness, but it can still have effects on us. And our brain is kind of processing this information as well. But it's not just that little things are getting in here and there. It's almost as if we have entire channels of information getting in below our conscious awareness, like echolocation, like lip reading information. All this stuff is getting in, even if we're not consciously aware of this information getting in. A lot of these skills are shared with animals. We know that bats and other marine animals, marine mammals, dolphins, whales, they echolocate. We understand actually a lot about their echolocation skills, a lot more than we understand about human echolocation skills, as it turns out. But it is just a really nice example of how we share these skills with animals, like sharing our ability, our theoretical ability to scent track with dogs. These skills can be enhanced depending on whether we have a sensory deficit of some type. Losing vision can enhance our sense of touch and our sense of sound. And it can also be done, these enhancements can be done through some sort of expertise that comes along with having a job that might do this, or some sort of hobby like learning a musical instrument or something like that. And then finally, we're going to, as I said, talk about these three concepts that have kind of become recent important discoveries in brain science. One is neuroplasticity, that the brain has this really, really powerful ability to change. We're going to learn the principles by which that occur. Mirror systems, which is just another way of saying that the brain has been designed to do this kind of very subtle imitation, and importantly, does this imitation both for potentially social reasons and perceptual reasons, to make us better perceivers of what somebody else is doing. And then this multisensory primacy, that the brain is working to take in all the senses and all the sensory information it can for any given action that we might be perceiving, and in some ways doesn't care whether this information is coming through our visual system or our auditory system or our touch system. So that's just kind of recapping what we're doing here. Okay, let's then continue. We've got 15 minutes. And you know what I'm going to do just to keep this interesting? Okay, hold on a second. Stop the sharing. If there's any questions, feel free to put them up, but don't feel compelled to. All right. Let's just take a second. Yeah, let's do this. Hold on just a second, just to make this interesting. Yeah. I will do the last part of the lecture with a kitty cat on my head. There we go. Okay. So we are now going to sorry. Sorry about this, everybody. Sorry to take a second. Let me make sure I'm sharing the screen. We're going to talk about human echolocation. I know you've been a little bit through this yesterday, but did Serena have a kitty cat on her head? No. Okay. All right. So let's talk a little bit about echolocation. And I know that you did learn a little bit about this yesterday, so this will be a tiny bit of review for you, but I want to kind of give you some of the mechanics of echolocation that Serena didn't go through. Just give me a second here. Yes. Okay. Shoot. Sorry, just give me a second to get back where we were. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about the history of human echolocation. And let's talk about blind individuals. I think you're going to find this really interesting. I don't think Serena talked about this. She might have, and if she did, I apologize. I certainly didn't mention for her to talk about this. But let me give you a little bit of the history. It's also in the book, but I think you're going to find this really cool. So for a long time, say, since the early 1900s, scientists started becoming aware that the blind could actually move towards walls or closed doorways and stop before they got there. And they could do so even if they weren't using a cane or a guide dog, which they didn't have a lot of back then anyway, early 1900s. So they would walk to a wall. They'd be walking down, say, a hallway or maybe outside, walking towards a building, and they'd be able to stop right before they got there. Okay. Then they would, reach out their hands and maybe kind of move along the doorway or the hallway or open the door or something like that. And when they were asked how they were able to do this, they would say, I don't know. I just have a sense that this thing is in front of me. I just have a sense that there's something in front of me that I have to stop at, or I'm going to get hurt, that I'm going to bump myself. Okay, can you tell us a little bit more? What is your experience? You say, well, I kind of, this is what they said. I kind of felt that there was something kind of imposing, kind of approaching my face. It's almost as like I could feel it on my face skin or something. I mean, they would say this, and more than one person said this. They would feel like that their face was tensing up, the muscles on their face were tensing up. Other folks said, I don't know, maybe I'm feeling less of a breeze or more of a breeze on my facial skin. But yeah, there's something, if I had to guess what it was, I would say that it was something on my face that was detecting the wall being in front of me. And for that reason, for a long time, this ability for the blind to stop before they got to a wall was called facial vision. Now, it's a term I'm going to ask you then to forget because, as it turns out, it is wrong. But if you ever see that term in any of the reading you do ever again, or on TV, sometimes they use this term. Facial vision is based on the blind's insight about how they were performing this skill. Because originally the blind would say, I don't know how I'm doing this, but if anything, I can say I feel something on my face. I feel something on my face, as does my kitty. Feel it on their face as I get close. Okay. The reason I have awareness next to that, that RE stands for regarding awareness, is because I want us to keep that in mind, because let me tell you now the rest of the story. In the 1950s, when kind of American research really got going after the war, these researchers at Cornell wanted to determine what about facial vision allowed the blind to stop before the walls. So they brought in these blind people, and they brought them up to the laboratory, and you get to kind of picture this, what it might have looked like back then. Actually, I've got a picture of it that I can show you in just a second. But the scientists are wearing lab coats, and everything looks very old. Everything is a beautiful old building at Cornell University. It's a great campus if you ever have a chance to go there. Beautiful old Gothic buildings, and this was inside one of them. The floors were wooden. It was a large space, and they brought these blind people in, and they asked them to walk towards a wall and then stop right before they got there. And they found out they could do it. They did it great. They would walk to the wall and stop before they got there. And they did the same thing that I was mentioning before. They would reposition where the wall was and reposition where the blind person had started walking from, so they were unable to use a trick like count the number of footsteps or something like that. It was like a new situation every time they tried it. Say, okay, good. We can establish that they're able to do this. Now let's test what's going on with their face that allows them to do it. So they did some really clever things. They took a piece of cardboard and kind of, I guess first what they did is they draped like a cloth over their face. Here, like this sort of thing. They took a towel and put it over their face and had them walk, okay? They could still perform the task, even though they had something over their face. Okay, maybe we're not getting rid of whatever this pressure thing is. Let's not put cardboard over their face. And so they had pieces of cardboard kind of taped around their face. I can't imagine this was very comfortable for them. But they were still able to walk to the wall and stop before they got there. Okay, say, okay, let's try this. Let's now have them wear cardboard all around their outer face, like all around here. And let's put fans in, like, kind of small fans that would mess up any sort of air currents that were, say, changing as a person was approaching the wall. They could still perform the task. And the story is, like, they had, this one guy who was doing it very, very well, regardless of how they were trying to mess him up, And he said, okay, they said, could we just try one more thing? And he said, well, let me try this. Let me just, my feet are getting really tired. Back then they wore those hard sole shoes, that weren't very comfortable. I said, let me take off my shoes and finish the experiment just in my socks. And if that's okay, you can do whatever you want. They said, okay, try it. Let's just make sure, take off your shoes and let's go ahead and walk to the wall and don't wear anything on your face, and we'll turn off the fans. Go ahead and do it. Let's just make sure you can do it. And he walked to the wall, and guess what? He couldn't do it. He couldn't stop before he got to the wall. Now, don't get me wrong. There's people there kind of, reaching out to make sure he doesn't get hurt or anything like that. It wasn't dangerous. He kind of had a little, he put out his hands. And, I don't know. I can't do this anymore. I'm not able to do this anymore. So, well, what is it about your shoes that allowed you to do it? And then they realized it was the sound of his shoes as he was walking to the wall that allowed him to perform this task. It had nothing to do with what was occurring on his face. It had nothing to do with the muscle of his face tensing up, or like the wind currents or something like that being different as he was getting closer to the wall. It had everything to do with the sound that his footsteps were making and how that sound was reflecting off the wall he was coming towards. Okay, they started to suspect that. Say, okay, you can't do it without your shoes on. Put your shoes back on. Let's see if you can do it. You put your shoes on. Worked great. They said, oh my gosh, your shoes are noisy. I bet that has something to do with it. And they were right. They had him do other things. Like he had a cane there. He said, okay, take your shoes off and go in your stocking feet, but use your cane and make a noise with your cane as you're walking. And he did that. He took his cane and went click, click, click as he was walking, and he could perform the task again. Said, okay, take away the cane and make some sound with your mouth. You know, maybe make a sound like the cane itself, like a mouth click sound, like click, 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 click. And as long as some sound was being made, he could perform the task. Once they took away the sound, he couldn't perform it. So it had nothing to do with his facial vision. It had nothing to do with air pressure on his face or his face muscles, you know, tensing up because something was coming towards it. It had everything to do with sound. And I think this is a really important component of what's going on. It's why I'm making such a big deal of it. And if you talk to Daniel Kish, he'll tell you the exact same thing. He could echolocate before he knew what echolocation was. He would tell you, when I was a kid, I would be able to get around without bumping into things, and I had no idea how I would do it. I would just feel something was in front of me. Okay? He didn't know about echolocation until he was a sophomore at UC Riverside taking a perception class, not mine, another guy's perception class way back when, where he learned about human location, and he said, oh my gosh, Professor, that's what I've been doing all my life. And then he became an expert, which is a great story. But the fact that he didn't know, and the blind didn't know that this was done by sound, is really important. That's why I have that awareness thing. That this is a great example of one of these, you know, kind of subliminal or, you know, kind of implicit perceptual skills, where we even have an expert like Daniel Kish and these other blind individuals who aren't aware of how they are able to perform the task. Because this is a lot of what goes on. This is a lot of what goes on, and we'll be talking about this fact, that these perceptual skills happen implicitly without conscious awareness, sometimes even by the experts. Okay, it's a very kind of typical thing to happen. All right, so let's learn a couple of other things about this. So here's Daniel. There he is riding a bike. There he is leading him out. I can't remember if I took that picture. No, I don't think I took that picture. I did take some pictures when I was out. If you read the first chapter of the book, you know about all this stuff, and you knew that I went bike riding with Daniel and Brian Bushway and another gal. I took pictures. I don't think I took that picture, but there's Daniel going around, and I can tell you a little bit about Daniel now. As I said, blind from birth, had no light vision as far as they can tell at any point. He had prosthetic eyes put in, I think, by the time he was 1, and that was because of his cancer of his retina. But he was able to ride a bike as early as most kids ride a bike. So what is that, like 5, 6, something like that? And he was able to get around his neighborhood by the time he was 10 or so, like you just saw him get around in that video. Here, I can maybe play it again for you guys. And the reason he's able to do this, he clicks, he makes this click sound like that. He's making this click sound. And he can tell when there's a parked car there, but he can also tell more subtle things. He can tell where he is in his neighborhood by listening to where the driveways are versus where the lawn is in between the driveways. So that's how he knows where he is in his neighborhood. He can count the driveways and know, okay, I've just counted 4 or 5 driveways. Now it's time for me to turn right. And all this sort of, you know, kind of very subtle reflected acoustic information is coming back to him and allowing him to perceive all this stuff. It's a really amazing story, and he's gotten better and better at it after he learned about echolocation. But even before then, he was able to ride a bike. Yeah, even before he was conscious of what echolocation was, he was able to ride a bike. When we start up next class, we'll talk about how this is something we can all learn to do, which you have a sense of from yesterday. And we'll talk more about Daniel Kish and his abilities next class as well. Okay, great. See you Thursday.